Hello, everyone. Welcome back. And we will be starting shortly this next panel on English for professionals in the professional orders. With this being said, I would like to take a few moments to introduce myself. For those of you who don't know me, my name is André Rousseau. I am the Executive Director of Cible, Retour à l'Emploi, an employment organization, a non-for-profit, which provides employability services in both French and English to the population of job searchers in the Montreal area. We have been doing so for the last 20 odd years, and I have been the acting ED of that organization for that long as well. I also hold the chair position of the employment sectoral table, one of 4 sectoral tables, which provides information and useful data to PERT for its ongoing mission. And I will also try to refrain myself from translating and saying all that I've just mentioned in both French and English. As you have probably already heard, this entire session is being recorded, and it is also providing simultaneous interpretation for either French or English native speakers, so that you may follow the discussion in either language that you prefer. This being said, I would also remind the audience that you may forward all of your questions as you go along, but using strictly the Q&A box, because the chat box will not be used for this purpose, and questions will be answered at the end only. Amongst a few that will be selected due to time constraints only. For our panelists, I also remind you that there is simultaneous translation, and therefore, would you please speak slowly and articulate as best you can for our translators to make it easier on them and make sure we have good and appropriate translation for our audience. Thank you very much for complying with this. And I will also signal you when your time is up by raising my hand this way and not the electronic way, because it's easier for me. And due to my old age, I think I will avoid technological problems. This being said, I am very pleased right now to introduce to the audience our current panel. We first have our first speaker, which will speak of how to improve French in the professional orders. We have Heather Halman. So Heather, may you take a couple minutes to please introduce yourself as the Center Director of Vocational Training for the CDC in Viau.
Thank you very much, André.
Over to you. You're welcome.
Thank you. I'm Heather Halman, as you mentioned. I'm the Center Director for Vocational Training at the CDC Viau. I'm sure everyone is wondering what CDC means. It's an acronym for Competency Development Center, and it's a vocational training center which is part of the Sir Wilfrid Laurier School Board. We're located in Viau, Laval. And as such, we offer programs in health assistance and nursing, the PAB program, which is now called Institutional and Home Care Assistance, as well as commercial programs, secretarial studies, accounting, computing support, starting a business, etc. Our territory is very large. While most of our services are offered in Laval, our school board actually covers the regions of the Lanaudière and Laurentide as well. So that presents some challenges in terms of having students access our programs because some of them are very, very equipment heavy and have to be housed in specifically dedicated facilities. So we have another center in Saint-Eustache, which houses our carpentry programs and the heavy programs that we have in the construction field. And we're opening another point of service in Terrebonne and Mascouche. These are in partnerships with French service centers. Because of our size, we're able to do that and capitalize on, the economic advantages of working together in order to offer services. So those programs are either offered bilingually or either in uniquely Francophone cohorts or Anglophone cohorts. So that's a little bit about what we offer in vocational training at Sir Wilfrid Laurier, and I'm the director of those services.
Thank you very much for that, Heather. Next, I would like to introduce to you Walid Al-Hamad, who is also a French language learner, as well as a licensed social worker and psychotherapist. To get to know you a little bit better, Mr. Al-Hamad, I will pass the mic over to you, so you may introduce yourself.
Thank you. Yes, like you said, I'm a licensed social worker, couple and family therapist, and a psychotherapist. I have my private practice, and I'm also an external psychotherapist for the ASCS in Ganawage, working with First Nation. I also work with Montreal City Missions as a group facilitator for immigrants on the issue of cross-cultural parenting. And I'm a research assistant at McGill University.
Thank you very much. Well, welcome aboard. And next, our third panelist, Miss Morgane Gagnon, who is also a policy researcher for the Provincial Employment Roundtable. Next to you, Morgane.
Thank you for the introduction. So yes, my name is Morgane. I'm a policy researcher with PERT. Researchers are not a regulated profession, nor do I, in my field, work directly with maybe potential members of professional orders. What I'll be speaking about today is mainly PERT's research on professional orders, which appears in our report, French language support for Quebec's English-speaking professionals. So this is a report we conducted over the last year or so, and I believe put out in the spring, although it may have been the fall, I can't recall. And the impetus for creating that report was hearing from our community that English speakers were struggling to practice their profession, even pre-Bill 96, owing to the language laws that were in place and the ways that these interacted or governed the different professional orders. So we pulled together a report interviewing representatives from professional orders, participants or members of professional orders, cataloging the available support programs and reviewing the different language policy documents to really get an in-depth understanding of what was available when we're looking at language learning or language support within professional orders, and maybe where there were some gaps in that. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe to slightly introduce our topic on today's panel, I would like to target a question more specifically as to the challenges that an English speaker learning French may face by switching from a profession that is not regulated to one that is regulated. And I would like to start with you, Heather, to try and answer this question from your experience and your perspective in your own field. What are some of the challenges that you have seen people face with this?
Well, I think the main challenge is that vocational training programs have requirements to be eligible to entry. And the requirements for most of them, if you're from Quebec, are secondary for French as a second language. So there's a presumption of competency there, certainly for entry into a program. But in order to be able to move through the program and go on internships and ultimately graduate and be employed in that program requires a much higher level of competency than French second language at secondary 4 level. And that becomes a huge challenge for us in terms of vocational training, because the programs are very specific in terms of the number of hours that are given for each competency, and the students move through those at very prescribed intervals. And the teachers that we have are not trained language teachers, they're trained professional in their trade. So they're secretaries who come and are trained to teach secretarial studies, computing support technicians, etc., but they're not trained language teachers. And the main challenge is that students are learning in English, but going into a working environment where they'll be mostly in French. And that has to be added on to everything else that we do in terms of an already really packed instructional schedule.
I see. Thank you for that. Same question over to you, Walid. In terms of your own experience as a professional yourself, what do you see are some of the challenges from migrating into a professional order from a non-regulated profession?
I mean, without passing the French exam, professionals won't be licensed. And so I know social workers who have master's degree, and it's been 10 years since they graduated, and they tried time after time to pass the exam. And for some reason, they just couldn't pass it. And until now, they have to work in lower jobs and have different pay, and they can't be licensed. And so it is an obstacle for many professionals really to be licensed and work with their degree.
I see. Thank you very much for highlighting that. Morgan, over to you. In terms of the research that PERT has done on this topic, are there any takeaways that you may like to bring to our attention right now?
Walid said, to join a professional order, you have to demonstrate either a French language proficiency. And so that would look like kind of one of 3 or 4 things. So either you have to have received at least 3 years of full-time study in secondary or post-secondary education in French, passed the 4th or 5th year secondary level examination with French as a first language, or obtained a secondary school certification in Quebec from 1985 onwards. And if you don't meet one of those 3 requirements, then you're required to, as Walid said, pass an OQLF French exam. And sometimes a professional order will also require you to pass a competency exam as well, that's more profession specific. So we see those as 2, and often those are in French. So those are kind of 2 big French language barriers. And we can see how they might affect, in particular, interprovincial migrants and newcomers, particularly because they're less likely to have moved through the secondary school system in Quebec. And so with those kind of formal language requirements, we see kind of all these spin-off effects. So the need to integrate language training kind of prior to that, maybe at some stage in the educational system, although as Heather said, it's very packed. We can see the need for different types of language support programs, although we know that there aren't that many of those. So in PERT's research, we found a total of 14 OQLF preparation courses and 13 profession-specific training programs, which to serve the entirety of Quebec might not be wholly adequate. And we also know that there's a lack of clarity sometimes about what specific language laws are, or what specific competencies are, the difference between being confident and being proficient in a language. All these different things kind of eat away, I think, at English speakers looking to enter to practice within professional order.
All right, thank you very much for clarifying that up. This being said, I think the next step in our discussion this morning is a more targeted question, which I will address to you, Heather, in terms of undertaking French language training, which usually falls primarily on the person himself or herself. So much that a lot of professionals are actually ending up leaving the province to go work elsewhere. What role do institutions such as schools and workplaces play in helping professionals to master French and stay in their field, and primarily stay in Quebec?
Well, I think we have a major role to fulfill in terms of doing that. As I mentioned, in vocational training or training for professional orders, the competencies are very specific. So the responsibility for language development, language acquisition, and then being able to work in a language is added on to everything that's already there in terms of the technical skills. So we work with our teachers to make sure that they're as bilingual as possible. We work with developing tools. We have a lot of lexicons and things that are specific to the program so that at least the students can acquire the terminology as a base of understanding, because we're very much aware of the fact that while they're learning in English, they're not going to be working in an environment that is exclusively English. So we try to invest as much as we can during the instructional time that we give them. And then we also encourage students to take other forms of language acquisition and proficiency development. So we have different tools for them. We have supports through adult education. We work with community partners. We have teachers who come in after class is over. In an already long and charged day, the students will even learn, more language course and take more courses afterwards. But that takes time. A language isn't acquired in a month or so. We'd like to think it's intensive, but it takes a lot of time. And it's not just knowing the vocabulary, but it's also understanding the culture of the French language and the workplace and the requirements. So while we give a lot of extra courses and things, sometimes it isn't always enough. The students aren't successful, especially in the nursing program where they will become a member of an order. In order to work in a public institution, they're required to have that level of competency in the language. And often the students aren't successful in those examinations, especially international students who come. And even though they're expected to have a level of proficiency in mother tongue, not second language, it becomes very challenging for them. And what we see is that while they'll be successful in the program because they've learned it in English and managed to get through the internships or the stages, they'll often go to other provinces thereafter. So it's very troubling for us because we're training people to go into the workforce and then they don't stay here and contribute to the society that we're trying to build. And the burden of a lot of that falls onto the schools who are already tasked with technical skills acquisition.
Well, thank you. Thank you for clarifying that up. Now over to you, Walid. Maybe would you like to respond to this same question?
Yeah, I mean, mentioning the individuals, usually these individuals obviously are not Francophones, and so many of them are immigrants. And so I was wondering if the system acknowledges that they have circumstances around the language, if they have other obligations in their life, and if this language is going to be another burden or a chore, to do. And we all know, through research, learning a language as an adult is a lot more difficult than learning it as a child. And so I know at McGill University, for example, there is a course geared to, let's say, social workers for the terminology and everything. But will that be good enough for them to practice, with Francophones, or would just give them an entrance to the language, or a limited usage of it? So that's why I was wondering if all the institutes have more creative ways of integrating the language into the work field, where people can learn it and at the same time get to practice it in some form of immersion.
Good point. Thank you very much for this. Morgan, would you like to reply?
Good question, Lily, though I know Heather's probably a better place to respond. Kind of in that vein, we recently also published a report on vocational technical training in Quebec in English language. And when we were drafting that report as kind of non-experts in that field, we'd originally thought well, this is a perfect format and the perfect timeline for French language learning, isn't it? So simple just to integrate the two. And we, quickly realized that is not the case. As you said, there are, as both Heather and Willie said, there are so many considerations to the time and energy that it takes to learn a language in addition to full-time studies. There are the different cultural elements, as Heather had mentioned, picking up workplace slang, that kind of thing. And also maybe the difficulty of integrating into maybe a colonial language or something like that. So I guess to speak to the role of educational institutions, it would require, or it's not something, as Heather said, that can be integrated necessarily directly into the program, because these English programs need to be the same length and have the same competencies as the French language programs. And so everything that's added on looks maybe more like an extracurricular that's added on top, that requires that additional energy and commitment to take on. So we're really interested at PERT at looking at kind of different maybe flexible opportunities. Are there things like bridging programs or different maybe work integrated internships or learning opportunities that recognize, that this language learning takes longer than a course, as you said, Lilith, or a month, as you said, Heather, and kind of integrates that as part of a longer term project, recognizing the commitment that takes.
Well, the thing that we have right now that helps address that, if you will, Morgan, is some of our programs, the ministry will give us permission to offer them as alternance travail-études, which means that we take time out of the instructional competencies and we add them to the internship experience or the stages. And we found that that's been very helpful, because the students spend more time in the world of work, in the actual placements, and they get a better experience in terms of the culture of a company or of an institution, and how to use the language in their profession, because we're teaching them the profession, but they have to practice it in another language. And that's particularly helpful for international students. Because they come often, it's not a second language, but often it's a third or a fourth language. And, there are also people who come with the hope to become, citizens. And so the rigor that's required in order to do that is very heavy on their shoulders. And that's done in addition to probably having families, children of their own, and also having to work at the same time that they're learning. So we do have a little bit of flexibility with, alternating the length of the stages, but that's with permission. And it also takes a lot of professional development for teachers to be comfortable in doing that, because then they have to compress the curriculum that's taught in the institution.
Thank you. That's an interesting sidestep to this entire discussion right now, and it has a lot to do with inclusion and being immersive in the learning process. I would like right now to direct the next question to you, Walid, in terms of learning French as a second language for English speakers entering a professional order. Do you think that current policies and programs within professional orders assist them adequately? And if not, what do you believe needs to be done about it?
Unfortunately, I find the way it is approached is a little bit punitive. Like, there's one size fits all, one exam for everyone. And if you don't pass it, then too bad, you're not going to get licensed. And the rest of your circumstances are not our problem. I really think that the concern I find here is the negative association, where people are beginning to have, or might have, a negative association with the language itself, though it's not the language's problem, but then they don't want to practice it anymore, or may barely pass the exam and then never practice it, because you cannot force people to, practice in a Francophone place of work. I really think there should be a gentler approach to it. And I really think there can be programs like Morgan mentioned. There can be, bridging of the language. We can hire people from the same culture to every group who can bridge two languages, or make it easier, making associations or making comparisons, or making, the differences. This is how they see it in one culture, and that's how they see it in the French culture. It can be done in a way where it's not another chore for people who are very busy with families, where it can be fun, it can be interesting, it can be rewarding. And I'm sure, that some people can put such programs together to motivate people to learn the language and wanting to do it, versus having to do it as a chore. And then once you pass the exam, never use it again.
Very well said. Thank you for that. Heather, would you like to add anything to this?
I think Walid is absolutely right. I think sometimes these things are used as gatekeepers, and in the sense of keeping out rather than letting in. And, it is punitive. If you fail so many times, you only get 3 chances, and then, your chances are gone. And I think that's an issue, because language is a bit like a commitment to fitness, right? We all know that we want to be fit, and we'll all join the gym in January, but how many people are there in March, right? And it's not something that happens overnight. It's like exercise, right? The more you use it, the better you become at it. And that involves intention as well. And I think that's part of the problem, is that we treat it like another subject they have to learn. And it is in some senses, but it's also the language they'll be working in, living in, earning in. And that, I think, takes time, and it has to have a positive scope to it rather than a negative scope to it. And it's very sad, when you hear, well, I'll learn it, I'll pass the test, and then I'll never have to use it again, right? That's really unfortunate. It truly is, because that's not how we'll retain quality professionals in our province and in our sectors.
All right, thank you very much. Morgan, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I'd love to. Maybe to follow up on that point about taking the test and never maybe you using the language again. I think that's something that might change under Bill 96, because it does stipulate that professionals will now have to maintain a level of French suitable to the practice of their profession. And so what we need is a widespread shift to recognize that this is a site of professional development. And as you said, Heather, something that needs to be integrated long-term in a kind of overarching way. And so that implicates maybe at the front end of things, maybe educational institutions, but additionally, professional orders themselves, we need to look to those as a site of or a source or resource for language learning. And maybe the punitive piece that Walid, you mentioned, it's certainly not to the advantage to English speakers or to linguistic minorities, but it's also simply not to the advantage of Quebec as a province, because we are in the midst of a labor shortage, particularly in fields like healthcare and construction. And those are 2 fields that are particularly heavily regulated, or which draw on professionals from professional orders. So we need to be thinking strategically about how to enable people to integrate into linguistic minorities, to integrate into the language, into the labor market, and to retain their position there. And that comes back to lifelong language learning.
Right. Well, I guess we'll stay with you, Morgan, for the next question, really. What do you believe are some of the most important consequences from the lack of French language training and accompaniment programs available to English speakers looking to work in professional orders?
Maybe first and foremost, so the one that most readily jumps to mind are the impacts on English speakers themselves, individuals looking to get a job in their field. And, you know, as Walid said, 10 years later, still aren't able to get a job because they maybe failed the course that you're only allowed to take 3 times. And we know in a kind of widespread or overarching way, English speakers in Quebec have a higher unemployment rate than French speakers by about 2%. And we know that English speakers earn a lower median after-tax income as compared to French speakers. So we're looking at issues that maybe relate to a full lack of employment or working in a job that they're overqualified for because they're not able to get the professional certification. Or alternatively, it might mean that people are leaving the province altogether. We did an employment survey in 2021, and we heard from a lot of people who were facing the idea of migrating out of the province, or alternatively lived close enough to transit to work in Ontario or in New Brunswick because they just weren't able to work in Quebec. And as a result, you know, that also impacts the broader English speaking community who need these services, who need to be able to go to an English speaking healthcare professional, a lawyer, anybody who works in a regulated profession and really needs to receive those often very essential services in their first language to be able to communicate that, or in the language that they're most comfortable in. So it impacts the English speaking community as well. We heard from Alan, I think at CASA yesterday in the panel about the need for English speaking healthcare workers in Gaspé. And then the maybe like third group or consequence I would pull out would be the impacts on Quebec. As I said in the previous question, we're in the middle of a labor shortage, and we can't really afford to have these professionals leaving the province and working elsewhere. We need to figure out a way to retain our professionals and our English speaking professionals to serve the province and to meet the needs that exist here.
Sure, thank you. Would you like to respond to this, Heather, or add something to this discussion?
Well, I think Morgan basically summarized the main consequences, and the main consequences is that a lot of training and time and expertise has gone in to getting people prepared to become a member of an order, and then they're not able to become and fulfill that. And what ends up happening is they either, as Walid said, they will work below their level of qualification, or they will become disillusioned and they will leave. But it also impacts the population in general. And I think that what Morgan said is very important for us to take note of, that, we do have people who need services in their mother tongue, in English and in French. And when we have people who aren't trained and available for that, everyone suffers because of lack of accessibility. So I think it has multiple impacts on the front end as well as the back end of it. But we already see the difficulty in finding people to hire, but there's also a difficulty in retaining these people once we do hire them. And I think we need to be very mindful of that as well, because we lose a lot of very talented people for these reasons. And those things are within our control. They're definitely within our control.
Thank you. Walid, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I see. I mean, a lot more consequences on a societal level where there's this negative association, where people started generalizing the issue beyond the language, where the language is politicized. For example, when youth protection were short on workers, and that was, a job that was designated to only social workers to be, delegates of youth protection. The government opened up and started accepting criminologists, psychologists, and other people, different professions, to work in youth protection because there was a need. And now we have a greater need in the health system, and they're still refusing to open up on the language issue, or try to compromise. And for example, I know that there are temporary permits, but they're not easy to get and they don't grant them to everyone. But there can be such options where people have a temporary permit where they can work while they're learning the language, rather than, you know, punish them and say, no, you cannot make a living, a proper living for your family until you pass this exam. So I think the consequences are a lot larger than the language itself.
Okay, that's a very interesting point. I believe right now we have reached a point in this panel where we would like to address a general discussion based on what has been said so far. And we would like to look over more specifically the role of professional orders in addressing linguistic barriers for individuals looking to enter an order. As professional orders adequately addressing linguistic challenges, why or why not? We've already touched on that point up until now, but maybe now is a chance to go a bit further on this very specific issue. And for that, I would like to start off with Heather.
Well, I think we need to work more closely with our professional orders. In the past, there's been a bit of a disconnect between the educational sector and then the orders. And so the job of the education sector is to train, you know, the students, and then they go and they become a member of an order. We need to work more in partnership. I'll give you an example with the OIIAQ. For our nursing students, the licensed practical nurses, we've taken steps to have them actually come into the center and work with our teachers and explain the requirements, but not only the requirements to become a member of the order, but what the order provides for its members thereafter as professionals in the field, what supports are there for them as well. And I think that conversation is an important one, and building those partnerships. Oftentimes, excuse me, exams will be translated into English, but they're not good quality translations. And the student can write the exam in English, but the quality of the exam needs to be worked on. So those are some issues as well. And really recognizing and understanding the importance of having well-formed professionals as a member of an order validates the profession and gives it even more importance in the province. So I think that's an important thing for us to do, is to work in partnership and to have our students, when they graduate, be honored to become a member of an order, understand what that means, and value and treasure that as something that that makes it a marquee profession in our province.
Great point. Thank you for this. Walid, would you like to add something?
Like I do in my profession, to be able to help anybody, I need to know where they're coming from and why they're where they're at. And I think just summing it up by saying, oh, these are individuals who need to learn French, that's not enough. Where are they coming from? What do they need? What would make them learn better? If we care to have them learn the language and the culture, then we need to be more welcoming than that. And we need to understand their circumstances.
Right. Morgan, care to comment?
A representative from a professional order join us today. But we have spoken with a number of different representatives, and those conversations have been really beneficial. And I think oftentimes it's a matter of articulating a need and the desire for partnership that maybe awakens more of the concrete steps towards that. I think it's also relevant that you know, the role of professional orders, rightly so, is to ensure that members are qualified and able to competently practice their profession, especially when, I mean, largely these are professions that are regulated for kind of a public good. You need doctors who are qualified and engineers who are qualified and that sort of thing. And it makes sense in that context why maybe the idea of language learning would fall off the priority list. But at the same time, you know, professional orders play a large role in conducting professional development with their members. And I think language training falls well within that scope. And I think maybe sometimes it's not picked up as a thread because there are so many different other bodies or groups who we might also view as responsible for facilitating that language learning. There's the educational institutions, there's the government, there's maybe the individuals. And so it's unclear who needs to ultimately pick up that responsibility. And maybe that can be spread over different bodies, but I think there's needs to be maybe some recognition of the importance, particularly under Bill 96 with the stipulation to maintain a working level of French, that this is a requirement for professional development that needs to be integrated within professional orders or offered by professional orders.
Thank you for that. With this being said, I will turn my attention over to you, Heather, again. Are you aware of any particular innovative solutions or programs that have been implemented either by your center or by someone else to help professionals wanting to enter an order overcome this obstacle of the difficulties of learning French and being supported to do so?
Well, I think the innovation that we have is recognizing that we have to work with our other partners, even in education, in order to support the students. So what we've done in our school board, and I know quite a few others do it as well, is we try to work with our teachers in adult education, especially the ones that teach in francisation, to work and partner with our teachers as well, so that we can build, as I said, lexicons that have terminology, but we also have to teach the students where that fits in. Not, you know, having the terms is wonderful, but you have to be able to articulate and use them. And the other thing that we work on is supporting our students in terms of documentation, because language is also, you know, it's written as well as spoken. So we work a lot with helping our students with the documentation in French, because Morgan's right, you know, an order is there for a reason, and it requires and supports the need for rigor, especially in the healthcare or in other professions. And we're a partner in that. In terms of innovation with language, we work on a lot of different things with our students. There are all sorts of apps that we give them and different kinds of things. We offer lunch and learns for them. We offer mentoring with them. So oftentimes we'll have someone who is an experienced, student or be able to bring in a newcomer and support them in that process and continue with them, because I think that's also important. And giving the professional development, our teachers take a lot of professional development in terms of that. And the other thing we do is we offer prep courses for them in terms of what they could expect when they go and write an order exam. And those are very successful. And that's an innovation that we've come up with that's very, very popular. And it supports the students in terms of reading case scenarios, understanding how to put their learning into action. So those are a few of the things that we've tried to do. But it's a start of a process. It's by no means an end.
Yes, I understand. Thank you for that, and congratulations also on your initiatives. I would like to hear from you, Walid, about your knowledge of such innovations within your own surroundings.
Yes, I agree that the order know what they're doing, but from what I learned, we live in a culture of individualism, and the world is split into two different cultures: individualism and collectivism. Of course, there are different versions of each. Sometimes the approaches of one may not apply for the other. And what I'm wondering is, are we taking that in consideration? Because even in social work, if you are helping people from a collectivist culture with individualistic solution, then you end up oppressing them as you're trying to help them. Do we have that versatility in our approaches? Do we have that versatility in our understanding of how to teach the language, for example, or what would be more accepted or more better understood, you know? All of this, and for that reason, I was thinking, do we have cultural matching methods where we have teachers who have already crossed that bridge and know the connection between two languages and can pass them on to, you know, a certain group of people? Or are we the kind of people who, no, we don't care, we're just going to give you the exam, you pass it, and the story? So that's the question.
Well said. Morgan, care to comment?
Different, but I was really interested yesterday to hear from our keynote speaker, Donna Lewis, about what they're doing in Wales to revitalize the Welsh language with different programs such as Work Welsh, but also their very flexible online platform, and the way that they're designing it to be very user-driven, I believe, and meeting the needs that people are bringing to them in terms of, say, different flexibility or different content requirements. So they spoke to not only the capacity, but the need to build confidence in a language. And it would be wonderful to see something like that emerge that is, you know, a one-stop shop for language learning that takes the confusion of of navigating the different resources and the pressure off the individual to do that, to have that in one place, and allows you to find support that meets your profile, or and on the other end of things, the creation of different supports, as Walid is saying, that recognize the different frameworks that people are coming from.
To build on what Morgan said, I think that's important. I think that we're in a situation where everyone has their voyage of discovery in terms of what's available. And having a one-stop shop, if you will, where everything is brought together, I think would be very, very beneficial. Because oftentimes in communities, people have to go and search these things out. They're not obviously or readily available to them. Very good.
Heather, it helps you to figure out maybe your personal journey and to understand that you have your professional training, your coursework and your education in that component, but also to figure out where French language training would fit into that and what it can look like in those different ways. It helps you to, I think, to visualize and to actualize that, those resources and to access that.
Very true.
Very interesting. Thank you. That's a wonderful discussion that we are having right now this morning on this so crucial topic. And now I believe we will turn our attention to the questions that were raised in the Q&A box. We actually have a couple right now that have been coming in. I will start off with the first one that is from Robin Long, who is asking, keeping entry-level skills in mind, language level is subjective to the different trades. How accurate are the professional order exams in relation to the expected fluency level? How congruent with the expectations of a workforce? For example, can students use support tools that would be expected use in the workforce, like spell checking in office packages, etc.? Care to answer? Sorry, Heather, would you please start off the discussion?
Thank you. It's a very good question that Robin is asking. I think oftentimes it's extremely subjective. And I think that oftentimes Students, when they're writing the exams, do not have access to those kinds of tools. And that's unfortunate because we're trying to test their knowledge of their profession and the order that they are going into. Not test their knowledge necessarily of the language, but their ability to use the language to express what they know. And I think there's a big difference there. And I think that's something that has to be addressed by the orders, and the quality of translation of documents and assessment tools as well is something that's important, because if they're not translated properly, then we don't necessarily have the ability to get out the things that we want to investigate, to find out if our candidate knows those technical things. So I think that we have to be very careful about what exactly it is we're assessing when we have those tools. And oftentimes I'm not sure that's the case.
Thank you. Maybe Walid, would you like to comment on this question?
I really don't know. I mean, how the exam can really dictate if people will even use the language or how good they'll be at it. There's no way of knowing. And I've known people who lived in Montreal for 10 years and couldn't pass it. And I know people who arrived a few months ago and then they passed it the first time, but it was not really an indicator of much. That's all I can say.
Okay, that's fine. Morgan, anything to add?
Yeah, this is something I think I've spoken to Robin about previously. The idea, especially that different professions would maybe require different levels of competency in different elements of language learning. So do you need stronger written or oral or maybe audio competencies? And from what I know, those aren't heavily integrated into particularly the competency exams from the professional orders, because as Heather said, those are more focused on demonstrating your competency. You just have to do that through your second language when you're an English speaker. But this is a fun and an interesting opportunity to think about the way that language refracts through these through the testing elements.
Thank you. We have another question also from Robin, asking, building bridges between institutionalized learning systems and professional development in the workforce is a great idea. For example, Heather mentioned having the OIIAQ come to the centers. How feasible is it to integrate this type of initiative into the program of study? It would build buy-in from all parties for the time frame to learn language, as not just during student studies, but long-term. Are there any barriers to this? We will keep on with the same order maybe and start off with Heather.
It is a great initiative. We've been trying to get the OIIAQ into our center for quite some time, and there was a great receptiveness recently, and we're very happy about that. They came and they met with the teachers on a pedagogical day and spent the entire day talking about basically, not just the exam, but the order in general, and what they require, where they're heading, and where we can be a partner in that journey with them. So that was a very important first step. The next step, I think, that we've recognized and that we're trying to put into action is that they come and they meet with the students, because those are their future members. And it's in their best interest to meet with them and to try to find a way in terms of not only support, but induction, bringing them into the profession and then supporting them and retaining them in the profession. And that speaks to being a partner in the professional development that will take place. But it's important that they hear from the end user in terms of what that professional development needs to be. And not just in terms of the rigor in the practices, but also in the culture of the profession, and in the languages that profession has to take on. And part of what we're also working on with them orbits around the truth and reconciliation. and making sure that we understand and embed in the curriculum notions of diversity and different cultures and different representation. And one thing that always comes out of that is never about us without us. So I think that's important that the orders are there. And different orders have different levels of rigor, and rightfully so. But I think as a partner in a profession, they play a big role in, as I said, the induction of members and the retention of members and the valorization of those members afterwards as well.
Well said, thank you. Walid, would you care to add anything?
I'm jealous of you, Heather, for that.
I don't do that very often.
Because I don't see really these bridges. They are probably, as students, we saw members of the order come once or twice to talk to us, but probably that was about it. But I don't see any bridges concerning, especially the language and the profession. And yes, I agree, there should be bridges where they can ease the student into, like concurrently with the language and work slowly and gradually without, overwhelming them. That'd be a great idea.
Mm-hmm. Well, recently, we read in the news, a lot of the students have failed. Over half of them failed the order exam. And we have to ask ourselves why. Students who are Anglophone can write the exam in English. But we have to ask ourselves, was it, because of the pandemic and more online learning? I'm not entirely sure about that. But I do think that one of the things that impacts on that is the ability to deliver the curriculum in depth and to make the links that are in the curriculum. And that's in all the trades, whether it's in construction or whether it's in health or whether it's in accounting or computing support, understanding the gestalt of things and understanding the links between the different elements, I think is critical in learning to know versus learning to do. And I think that's really important. And I think the orders play a big role there. I really do feel that.
Thank you. Morgan?
Yeah, I think where, these bridges exist, they're often maybe new, and where they're not new, they're maybe more ad hoc. There are 46 professional orders governing 53 professions. And then there are all the different educational institutions that they would have partnerships with. And what we found in our report, or maybe what we didn't find, was a kind of systematization in those relationships and in those bridges. And so I think the barrier, if there is one, is the lack of the bridge. And in that case, that's the solution would be to develop those partnerships and to do it in a sustainable and I think systemic kind of way that ensures that they exist for everyone, for each professional order.
Thank you. Well, we will close off our discussion with one last question from the Q&A box, which comes from Jacqueline Vachon, which asks, with many Quebec educational programs now requiring a minimum B1 or B2 French fluency for program entry, this has likely reduced recruitment of future health professionals. This approach ensures students will be able to function in clinical internship placements. Thoughts on this French fluency requirements for program entry versus having French language courses integrated in course curriculum? Heather?
Well, I guess we end in the same way that we started. And that's exactly what I was, discussing when we first came on, is the challenge we have in integrating that into the instruction, where the instruction is already very, very prescribed and doesn't have a lot of fluidity in terms of being able to, maneuver the hours, etc. So that's something that we try to do. Is it systemic? And is it as formalized as we'd like? No, because sometimes, especially in health, It's a rigorous program, and some of the competencies are very, very challenging, especially for second and third language learners. And to be able to enter the program, if you're a local student, it's French second language at that level. If you're an international student, it's the B1 or B2, but the order requires even a higher level of competency in order to be successful. So it becomes a real challenge in terms of how we get the students to that level and have them be comfortable in it and be able to work in it, because it's one thing to learn the language, it's another thing to work in the language when it's not your first language or your mother tongue.
Oh, most definitely. Thank you. Walid, over to you. Would you care to add anything?
I'll only comment about how challenging it was for students at the English universities to find internships here, because there are very few places that would take, these students who came here to study in English and then probably go back home didn't come here to learn the language, and that's what it was still an obstacle for them, and internships were very limited. But I can see even with the courses that they can take at the university, it was still not at that level that would enable them to carry a fluid conversation in the French language.
I see. Morgan, final thoughts?
From a practical standpoint, I understand if a program requires off the bat immediate French language proficiency to some degree, it would only be discouraging to allow students into that program when they don't have that proficiency, because you're not setting them up for success. I think, integrating languages into course curriculum is also helpful. I think that what it comes down to is that there's no one size fits all solution. We need robust language learning, and it needs to look like a lot of different things. It needs to look like language supports. It could look like integrated French language learning where that's possible in the classroom. It could look like bridging programs. It could look like work integrated learning. So I think maybe the framing of an either or could be dissolved. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for this. I would like right now to thank the audience and our panelists for this very interesting and enlightening discussion that we just had on entering professional orders with the theme of learning French as one of the competencies required. Our panel is now over. We will take a short break for lunch right now, and we will be right back at 1:30 for the next panel, which is on education to employment in Quebec's English-speaking communities. Thank you very much, everyone, for staying on and for contributing to this discussion. Thank you.